So suddenly you start seeing images of people being labeled in such a way that we maybe are not comfortable with labeling people to begin with, but now that's the language that's being associated with this material. How does that relate to our social media experience? Well, we don't necessarily know how our own images are being labeled or tagged and how they're being circulated, right? But we also don't necessarily see the tagging and labeling process when we're seeing content, for instance, on our Pinterest feed or on our Tumblr or something like that. We just see the post itself. We don't necessarily see how it's being labeled on the back end. And so this language is potentially being circulated and perpetuated without our knowledge, and it is, at least on a low level, impacting our understanding of identity, and certainly your data's understanding of identity and its understanding of your own identity, if that makes sense. And Michael will explain this more in a second. I'm bringing all that up to say that identity as a concept on social media is susceptible to both human and non-human influences. And that's something that streaming and online or consumer-targeted online services have been very quick to capitalize on. And I wanted to show this example from Hulu. If you watch Hulu, you recognize the fonts, right? They use your data to make a series of assumptions about advertisements that might be relevant to you. So they think about maybe your income or your location or your age or something like that. And they make the decision that Lufthansa is a company that you might be interested in, buying flights from, right? So they say, okay, what Lufthansa experience would you like to have? And they're asking you to make a decision between, Cece and Chris. Which of these two people do you kind of want to have be as part of your advertisement experience? And when you make that choice, that's going to further impact the kind of material that you get going forward. So they're going to use that to further individualize your advertisement experience, your content experience, and it tells them something about you. It kind of goes into their understanding of your own identity. So it's a combination, as you can see, of both human and non-human influence in this particular case. So I'm going to turn this over to Michael to talk more about how this is working with Pinterest.
Yeah. So talking a bit about those non-human forces, from years of research on social media, we know that bias and structures of control manifest themselves in various ways throughout the system, like Sarah was describing. At this point in the project, I want to focus on the back-end math of social media and note that, as you might expect, these processes are also subject to criticism. To set the current context for Pinterest, I want to focus on the technical process of information retrieval specifically and how it has transformed over the past 5 to 10 years. So information retrieval is the automated technical process of recalling a small set of information from a larger collection. Most recognizably, this process is seen in search functions like Google or your local library website. It is important to note that this process is fundamentally numeric and computational. As a result, dimensions must be operationalized and quantitatively compared to achieve correct results. For example, a rudimentary search algorithm would take text into a search bar and compare it to billions of possible results by matching words in the query to words in documents. And then the result with the most matches would be returned first. That's the kind of numeric, quantitative process that happens. Much of the work in information retrieval is focused around making processes like this, like the one I just described, faster and more accurate. However, the focus of our study is not search like Google, but rather information retrieval systems known as recommendation systems. In a recommendation system, what would be the text in the search bar, like you would type into Google, is instead swapped out for this datafied user. So the user themselves are the query, and the textual search is exchanged for this user and their quantified attributes. So we all experience information retrieval every day almost through these like feeds that are catered to us. I want to talk a little bit about the structures that construct those feeds. The specific structures of information retrieval systems have become more complicated and layered as computational power has allowed for more intricate and computationally expensive processes. As a result, veiled machine learning models have been implemented throughout the systems with various roles. Many of these processes can be seen as black boxes with the goal of maximizing the success of recommendation systems. However, They also utilize more simple and straightforward filtering approaches that we'll discuss later to create candidate results for these machine learning processes. Together, systems create complex, balanced, and layered information retrieval architectures, much more complex than the one I described earlier, that simple one with the search, that allow for personalized results differing between individual users. So moving to the data of these structures, captured data is the center of these modern architectures. They are constantly weighing and balancing certain attributes, and models use data to make decisions throughout the retrieval process and decisively curate the content in your feed accordingly. To make data readable for these systems, user movements must be operationalized into grammars of action, this quantitative analysis that we're describing. So they count clicks, drags, watches, closes, things like that. And then structurally, that data is collected into a database. Remember when Netflix would have you rate your content with stars? You would, like in the image on the right? Their shift away from this technique, I don't really do that anymore. The shift away from this technique reflects a larger shift in data collection for recommendation systems in the past 5 to 10 years. The shift has moved away from explicit data like the stars, stuff that you would clearly express with preferences, clearly explicitly expressed, to more implicit data like clicks, watches, scrolls, and eye movement, like I was describing. So this is a shift towards this idea that the body never lies. And it's part of a larger movement of recommendation systems that targets the individual in their actions rather than their words. In a sense, it simplifies the process of recommendations for both users and programmers, but it targets the individual directly in their movements rather than their agency of the user. So now at Netflix, the most valuable data collected are these implicit grammars of action. They're watches, clicks, and scrolls. So moving to the metrics of these information retrieval systems, how do they evaluate success? Using this new user data, recommendation systems focus the retrieval architectures towards a specific metric of success. And this metric of success has changed a lot over time. A metric meant to quantify the value of a specific result of a retrieval system to evaluate the quality of that result. And then over time, tweaks are made to a system to maximize this metric to create better search results. And this is kind of the iterative, agile process of improving an algorithm. So as recommendation architectures have shifted over the past 5 to 10 years towards the more abstracted, layered, and implicit structures I'm describing, metrics of success have shifted as well. Perhaps most importantly, these metrics of success have reoriented away from traditional understandings of mathematical and statistical accuracy towards more user-centered metrics of success, or the idea of user engagement. A metric that is calculated using this implicit data I previously described, like clicks or scroll time. And our architectures now do not quantify the success of a particular search result based upon the statistical accuracy of information, this root mean square error. It's like it's a calculation that happens. They do not use this anymore, but they evaluate the success of a retrieval system based on the extent to which that result increases user clicks, scrolls, and time on the web page. So this new approach is thought to be a captological way of thinking, in that it attempts to capture user attention. Using these metrics and other behavioral modeling techniques like those introduced by the tipping point by Malcolm Gladwell, systems and businesses like tech companies attempt to hook and capture audience behavior and attention to maximize business incentives. And this is the kind of narrowing of action between all the possibilities towards they want to focus our actions towards this profit. And recommendation systems are constructed with this goal in mind and automated to maximize this goal and the capture of user attention and engagement. So this kind of sets us up for the current technical moment of modern social medias that are centered around this recommendation system, like TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify. They all have this home page or recommended information. And this recommendation structure I described, one that is centered towards engagement and attention, is the center of these systems. While certain aspects differ between social medias depending on their business structure, Pinterest specifically is a form of this type of captivation and utilizes similar methods to provide content to users. These methods are complex, intelligent, personalized systems with the goal of maximizing user engagement and captivation. These new systems can be thought to provide a flexible, diversified form of governmentality that creates new conditions of control by creating new techniques of individuation. These new forms of individuation create users that are different like everyone else, in that they have unique content, lifestyles, and perspectives, but with the same end goal of captivation and profit.
We wanted to give a little bit more information now about why we felt Pinterest was especially compelling for this project. The first is that unlike other platforms, Pinterest frames itself around what people love and on projects around their life. There's not a focus on debate or discussion. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but there are implications in terms of identity in focusing on improvement of the self. And Pinterest is also different from other media platforms in that the content is hyper-individualized. So there's not an emphasis on trending topics or one universal Pinterest experience. We were really excited about this, and we were also interested in the methodological challenges it presented. So we're on Twitter, it was much easier for us to pull data around one hashtag, and then began to analyze the different conversations and user community groups that emerged around that moment. It was more difficult to get a sense of what these different Pinterest user experiences were like. And we were curious if it was possible for us to replicate or compare user experiences across different factors like gender, age, browsing habits, and these other data-generated values. And then another way that Pinterest chooses to present itself apart from other social media sites is that as an ethical space. So Pinterest does not have qualms about deplatforming or any desire to consider themselves neutral. And in part, this can be attributed to the fact that they're not a news space. One example of this is that Pinterest disabled search results for anti-vaccination related materials and worked to remove all anti-vax content from their site. They felt they had a responsibility, especially as a host of parenting content, to reduce harmful misinformation. And then they often take a step past deplatforming. For example, they both reduced content related to self-harm using kind of a similar combination of machine learning and human moderation as they did with anti-vax content. But they also introduced a feature called compassionate search. So it surfaces a pop-up box for users with a check-in and resources depending on what they're searching. And that can range from people searching terms that are associated with self-harm, and there's a pop-up that gives different resources around suicidal ideation, and there's also a pop-up that comes up with different mental health resources and a check-in for people who are searching terms associated with stress and anxiety in the workplace or in school or other kind of areas. There's one additional way that Pinterest stands apart from other sites, and it's not one that they proclaim as part of their brand identity. In fact, their founders deny creating the product in any attempt to capture a particular demographic or spending group. But women do make up the majority of Pinterest users. And more than 80% of US female parents aged 18 to 64 are Pinterest users. So that's most moms in the US. And this user base has a huge impact on both the public perception of what Pinterest is and who it's for, and is also reflected in the platform's infrastructure. So there are scholars who've done work looking at the gender script of Pinterest and how it dictates user behavior. This starts with the language I mentioned earlier in terms of framing what Pinterest is for and what you do there. But it also extends through the sign-up page, Through tutorials, there's a focus on collaboration over competition. Pinterest does not emphasize